first prize winner of the North Street Book Prize. So welcome. And we also have Toyoshima, the creator and illustrator of Secret Asian Man comics. Toyoshima has been tackling issues in social justice and diversity for decades with blunt honesty and humor.
I try.
Welcome, Tak. And I just gotta say that Tak is like this. He's a quiet inspiration to so many comics. I had this event a little while ago where we brought in all of these comic artists that we had interviewed for Comics in Color, and as well as Tak. And we went around and talked about like what got you into comics and what influenced you. This man's name came up. Almost every single person was like, yeah, I read Secret Asian Man and I thought it was cool and I wanted to make comics. So
It's my fault.
it's totally his fault that we're all super into comics. So.
Nice.
Yeah, so I'm really excited to be here and talk about this subject. It's something that I explore in my own work and it's important to me. So let's get started. So I always like to ask when I speak to people on panels, what got you interested in making comics in the first place? I mean, comics it's not like going into business or something like that where you're like I want to get rich. You don't say, I want to get rich making comics. That doesn't really happen. So what's caused you to want to get into comics? And we'll start with you, Todd.
So I guess, I don't know, I wanted to get rich.
Yes, and how's that working out for you?
Well, I mean, so I grew up in New York City. I grew up with a healthy diet of manga comics from Japan, as well as American comics, and Marvel was the stuff that I used to love to read. That I would go into Chinatown. I grew up near Chinatown, so I'd go to the little Chinese stores and buy Hulks and Spider-Mans or whatever it was. Come home and see my Dr. Slumps and my Shogun Warriors, and kind of the two kind of blended. They didn't seem like competition or even very different to me growing up. They were just comics to me. My dad's an artist, so there was kind of already an artistic bent in the house. We were allowed to draw on the walls, so if you go to my house, 3 feet and under is like just scribbles all over the place. So that was encouraged. So that wasn't looked down upon. I have an older brother who's 4 years older, who also liked to draw at the time. And growing up, we played lots of D&D and role-playing games and things like that. So we did a lot of character designing and world creating, and so a lot of imagination, a lot of creativity around. So. I saw comics as something I just kind of latched onto as this, this medium, and thought I'd try.
Nice. All right. Well, it's funny that you mentioned the drawing on the walls thing. When I was a kid, I went to Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's house, and there was all these. They had written poems on the wall, and I got home and I was like, "That's so cool." And I started drawing all of my mother. Did not appreciate it at all. And little did she know I'd be so famous. It'd be worth money.
There you go.
But same question to you, Dave.
Yeah, I got into comics fairly late, I would say. I grew up with comics, but kind of like cheap, I don't know, commercial tie-ins, so like Transformer, G.I. Joe comic. And they had, they had a certain art. No, I'm not saying anything's wrong with that, and there's plenty of artistic merit to all that. But actually, like sitting down and looking at a graphic novel was, didn't happen until college, and a lot of my student colleagues really encouraged, me taking a look at comics in that way. And then, maybe sometime about 10 or 15 years ago, I actually started to consider making stories that way. And I started off with zines, and there were a ton of craft fairs in Boston at the time, and I was always showing my zines off and trading zines. And I started to see that it was a pretty effective way to tell a story with words and images. And then that led to talking to my grandmother and trying to get her story down in some way. I didn't even necessarily think comics would be the way to do that. And then eventually it did. And I think I had more of a gradual kind of education of comics through my own fault. But I made up for it.
Yes, and you feel like that. Zines are that gateway drug, right?
Yeah, totally.
Just make these little things. And explodes into it. Okay, Ingrid, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, I had real strict immigrant parents, so we didn't even really have comics in the house. We had free comics at the church basement. I remember I had like 90s Spawn or like 90s Image comics. That was like what my brothers were into. And then whatever I could find at the public library. So that was my early introduction. And then for how comics entered my life, it was really just like a form of therapy. I'd get done with my 9-to-5 job and I'd be like, I want to make something. What's like the thing that I can do in the storytelling format? Like writing wasn't working, so I started making images and drawing sequential art. Yeah. But yeah, it's so interesting. The drawing on the walls would never fly, but I think drawing growing up as a kid was my main expression, what I was allowed to do, even though I had really strict parents.
So you were already doing like illustrating before you got into comics?
Yeah, my brothers and I were like would have like drawing contests at home, and they would always let me win because they're very sweet. But yeah, it's sort of been with me since I was a kid. But yeah, only been drawing really since like 2016.
Oh,
Seriously.
okay.
So very new.
Very cool. I love it. It's like everybody kind of has their own. I love the stories about how people get into comics. That's why I like to ask that question. You all have very different answers, which is great. So what aspects of your identity find their way into your comics? You know, like we all, put pieces of ourselves into our artwork. But what identities come out in this? A part of your identities come out in the stories that you tell. And we'll let Dave start that one.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I was very reluctant to have my own identity come out, especially because I've had pretty specific, not exactly confrontations, but kind of microaggressions and aggressions about like how I'm not a Spanish-speaking Latino, how it's just not my first or second language. And I read this like really poetic kind of thing on Instagram about how like reaching for Spanish is like a phantom limb, and that's exactly how it is for me. When somebody talks to me in Spanish, it's like I know what I want to say, I just can't say it. And so like there was always that aspect to my Latino identity. It would always fell short of everyone else's. And so as a way of maybe like in hindsight, I compensated for that by really aggressively wanting to know my grandmother's story and get these stories down on paper, almost as a way of saying like, hey, I'm part of this group too. you know? So my identity via my grandmother's story has definitely been the focus of my comics, especially the Este Consuelo. That's kind of absorbed my art making for the past at least 6 years, and now that the graphic novel's out, now I can kind of use that as a point that I can pivot and look to other aspects of my identity that I can be influenced by.
It's really beautiful work. And did you have like a relationship with your grandmother, like a really good relationship, or was you were trying to seek that relationship with that book?
Well, it helped that I had a really good relationship. So like she had 10 kids, and so my grandmother's one of those 10. My mother is one of those 10. And so there's, as you can imagine, there's a ton of grandchildren also. So we were all fighting for attention. And so, like, because I'm her godson also, my grandmother's godson, that kind of gave me a leg up, I think, in the chain.
Double connection.
Yeah, a little hookup there. And so, that kind of, we were close, and that helped. It wasn't like, hey, Grandma, can I suddenly get these stories from you? It's like, no, these conversations have been happening throughout our whole lives. And
wonderful.
Yeah, it was nice.
Awesome. Ingrid, how does your identity find your way into your comics and artwork?
I think the most simplistic answer I can give is like when you're biracial but you don't look like both sides, you get really used to storytelling all the time. Like I had to give people my background, my life story to explain why I look the way I do. And I think that's like kind of where the first comics I ever drew came out of, was just I had all of these like things I wanted to process. So I would make comics at the end of the day going like, was that racist? Should I let me just process that and like draw out what happened and like see it on a paper. But yeah, definitely the identity piece is just part of the original work. And like I said, I started drawing in 2016. And I was really thinking about I guess the Obama presidency, and I was like, oh, maybe there's room for nuance in stories, and maybe this is something I can explore. But yeah, it's there. It's in my comic Secret Black Woman, which is mostly autobiographical, but little details and also the characters. I think every artist struggles with like a lot of the characters they draw kind of look like them. And so there was like that kind of organic thing that I can't even help. Like my characters will just look like people I know or who I grew up around.
Great. Yeah, I think it's a really good way to, kind of find your place, right? Like explore some of the things that are trying to work out in your head by putting them down as comics. All right, Talk, how about you?
It's very, very Asian of you to overanalyze things. So that part of you just broke out. I mean, I think at first when I started doing comics, I didn't think about identity or anything. I just had stories I wanted to tell. A lot of it was just things growing up. Here's what it was, as a Japanese kid growing up in Chinatown, and just naturally things happened. Things didn't occur to me at the time. A lot of times that they were weird, or I got kicked out of the house because I was Japanese, because my Chinese grandmother found out I was Japanese, and Japan and China doesn't have a good history together, and like you don't realize these things until afterwards. So, a lot of it kind of just does become therapeutic. But I think identity-wise, when I first started, Secret Asian Man, there's the word right there in the title. I must have, I got to gravitate towards that now. Kind of stuck to it. So now I found myself kind of seeking what that meant. So I'm like, okay, so Asian, that must mean I must talk about these things. There's Kung Fu, Bruce Lee, I'd kind of have the laundry list of things, And, so I would try to cover all those issues as best I could. But then I think after a while, I started feeling like I was almost being a projected version of an Asian person that I thought I was supposed to be versus who I actually am. So then I kind of toned it down and started focusing much more on actual things that happen, actual feelings that I have, actual words that I've used to describe certain people, and just being honest about it and being, just putting it on paper and having that be, again, back to the therapy thing, serve as a kind of a reflection of where I'm at. And how comfortable I am, and how I would like other people to also feel comfortable in that way, having those discussions and not feel like you shouldn't say this word because I'm not supposed to. Just if you feel like saying it, just say it, because what's the worst that can happen? I guess bad things can happen. It hasn't so far. So.
But yeah, your comic was like, for me, was like eye-opening that you could tell stories about yourself. Right, because up until that point, I was into superheroes. I was into Garfield. I was into like Calvin and Hobbes. These are the strips that I like, and I never considered like, oh, I could talk about like experiences that happened to me until I saw Secret Asian Man, and it felt very personal. Right.
And I think the way to reach the most people isn't to tell a story that you think most people want to hear. It's the most personal story, and you'll find that the audience will come to you looking for that, and that's the connection. People will get more out of that than some crafted thing.
I agree.
Yeah.
So somebody may have answered this question a little bit in your last answer, but have you found anything out about yourself through your art? Have you had any like, oh, I didn't realize this about myself, as you're like even like reading back through your artwork? And I'm going to let Ingrid start that one.
Well, this is like maybe just recency bias, but my like current comic that I just released is really, it started out as I was collecting stories from like girlfriends and moms, and I'd worked in the pregnancy industry for a little while, so I had all these like horror stories about womanhood and motherhood. And I realized as I was like kind of drawing them and making them, I was learning a lot about myself as a woman and like thinking through my own fears through it. So something that like started as a funny idea, I was like, oh, I want to write some funny feminist horror. Turned into something that was like, ooh, I'm like looking in a mirror.
It's funny how it kind of happens even without you intending it to. That's pretty cool. How about you, Dave?
I think I found out that I'm more of a morning person in terms of like when I'm able to work. I work, like many people, like full-time job that I just left to pursue freelance work and teaching.
Yeah.
And
everybody leaves a job.
yeah, and so like I was always working nights and weekends on these projects, and just having a freer schedule, like you're actually I actually was able to find out more of like what my natural rhythms are with working. So it's really changed my relationship to workflows, to the types, maybe not so much the types of stories that I want to tell, like not yet. It's definitely gonna influence it, I think, just because I have more time to be thinking about all this stuff. Yeah, I'm more of a morning person.
Yeah. Well, as like an independent comic publisher, like putting out your own stuff, that's important,
Yeah,
right? Knowing
yeah.
your workflow and when you can just pick it for yourself. It's not a 9 to 5 job. Knowing when you are the most creative and when you can get stuff done is super duper
Yeah.
important.
Yeah.
So that's a good thing to know. So what about you, Tim?
I mean, probably the thing I realized pretty quickly was how little I actually knew about Asian American history. You know what I mean? Like you think, oh, well, I am, so I must know, but it doesn't come preloaded. So, and this was like, showing my age, early internet, Google wasn't quite fully fleshed out. So as I found out things, like once I ran out of childhood stories to tell, like you only have so many memories you could delve into, you started looking for new things. So I started looking at, Asian American history and realizing, some colleges offer it as a course. There's a very academic way to go about it. There's a very cultural way to go about it. There's arts. And so it was a lot of fun finding these beacons that I could just hold on to. Then it became a point of pride to then bring that story into light in a comic and just share that and just kind of spread that knowledge. So that to me was, I realized how un-Asian I was in that way, and not knowing. And once I got to a certain point, Secret Asian Man kind of became like a beacon. So like they'd put up the bat signal and they'd be like the Secret Asian Man symbol, like, look, injustice, Asian Americans, this story, right? And I'd be like, actually, I don't know anything about that story. And I almost felt the pressure to have to know every single wrong thing that happened to every single Asian person in the country. Which I don't, and I still don't, and I don't even know all the actors and all that kind of stuff, which some people can try to drill me on, but I realized my own limitations as to that knowledge too, and that's fine. Like nobody can know all of that stuff. I'm sure there's some that do, but I'm not one of them. So
So your strip Secret Asian Man taught you that you weren't as Asian as you thought you were.
this is true.
It's a secret.
Or I was supposed to, as
Right,
Asian I was
as
supposed to
people
be.
thought. Gotcha. That's great. So here's the big question, and I'm gonna let you start on this one, Dave. Has there been any challenges with using yourself or your family as the basis of your work?
I think the challenge with Diaz de Consuelo and using my grandmother as a subject was the fact that she's 3,000 miles away from me. So it was mostly phone conversations and then occasional in-person conversations whenever I was able to fly home. I'm from El Paso, Texas originally. So there was that. I mean, that's with technology, it's kind of an easy thing to get over. But just to tack onto what Talk was, no pun intended there, talk onto what Talk just said. Yeah, the amount that you don't know, like finding out that when you're dealing with stuff like history, and in this case, the Mexican Revolution, I didn't know anything about it, and it was just this phrase that just popped up occasionally in her stories. And I had to become like this amateur expert on it, just to be able to write about it myself. And I found that it was fascinating, and it got me a little angry that growing up on the Texas-Mexican border, that none of that history was ever taught to me, ever touched upon. Except occasionally, like when you walk around, like downtown El Paso, you might see a plaque. But other than that, there wasn't anything for it really. And so then the work becomes this responsibility you have to tell the story correct. And then so there's this weight to this story that if you're just telling family anecdotes, you can certainly do that, and you should, if that's what there's a tremendous value in that. But if you're trying to place it in a historical context, there's extra work to do, and just figuring out that there was some extra work to do with that, that was pretty intense.
Yeah, I love how the Mexican Revolution, or at least in the books I've read. I don't think I have all your books, but it's like this overhanging thing. Like she's doing her daily life, going to the market, but there's like this. It's kind of hanging just above the frame, almost. And it's very cool. And is your abuela cool with you telling her stories?
Oh, she loved it. Yeah. So it was serialized, and so she was able to see the first four. It was serialized into 6 issues. She was able to see the first 4 published, and she saw a draft to the 5th before she died at the age of 104.
Wow. Shout out to Grandma.
Yeah. Mind like a steel trap to the end. Yeah.
Awesome. How about you, Taka? I know you kind of use your wife and your children.
My wife, who's here, Tracy, along the wall
Who's a
there.
character in your
So,
comic sometimes.
I mean, kind of in stages. Like in the beginning, I solely focused on me, maybe every now and then my immediate family growing up, like my brother or something like that. But then once I started getting syndicated, and I was in the dailies, I was asked to kind of create a cast. Like, well, what's his name? I'm like, well, his name is Secret Asian Man. He can't be called Secret Asian Man. He's got to have a name. What's his job? What's his family? So then that's when my wife entered the cast. Our one son at the time, and so that became observations from around the house and things like that. And Tracy usually gets the better of me, so like that would be consistent with that as well. And that was kind of more the dailies. Right now, currently, I'm working on a story that takes place of my life during middle school years. So 12 to 14-year-old, like just think back to that time of your life, and very formative years. For me, it was in the '80s, so it's gonna have an '80s New York Chinatown flavor, and a lot of looking into this book. Probably will be the most looking into my immediate family that I've done ever, probably. With my brother, he was the dungeon master. He was the guy I grew up with. He was the guy who taught me how to draw, pretty much, as well as my parents, and getting inklings of historical stories from them, like things with like fire bombings of Tokyo and relatives I've never met because of things like that. And so it's been interesting kind of using that part of my brain and having those conversations with my parents and with my mom. My dad passed away, but so it's
Has
been
it
neat.
been challenging though? I mean, sometimes the older generations, particularly like immigrants or African Americans, they don't like to talk about like their.
They don't want to air that
experiences. Right? Like
publicly.
if things happen that were less than ideal,
Right.
like sweep it under the rug.
I think so, and I think it probably helps that a lot of the stuff, especially with my parents, aren't those kinds of stories. It's more the things that I was kind of experienced growing up around them. Like, so my dad was an artist, so there was a lot of art stuff around, and to learn about where that art came from, which was a lot of like found objects, junk piles. That was kind of the art form. And this was shortly after World War II, so suddenly putting it into that context and seeing photos of back then, and there's soldiers still walking around in Tokyo, and not really thinking about it as a kid, but then looking at it as an adult, being like, oh yeah, this was happening while this was happening, and they both happened at the same time. And so there haven't been difficult stories as far as that, like airing out dirty laundry. Probably the relationship with my brother has been the most interesting, because after we stopped playing D&D and that kind of stuff, he went to college, and so I was on my own for 4 years in high school, and then after that he kind of like moved out, and so after that you're never really as close. I was never really as close with him after that point. So this is my chance to tell that story. I don't think I've ever sat down and had that conversation with him, so it's going to be interesting to have that conversation, I think.
Mm-hmm.
But nothing bad.
So nobody's been like,
We had a couple
say
fights,
that,
but
or that wasn't me who did that, or there's no
not
like
so far.
conflicting versions of events.
There might be.
It might come up.
There might be.
It happens. Awesome. And how about you, Ingrid?
Oh, I've definitely got the conflicting events. It just happens when you write comics about your family. They kind of have no say over it unless they can draw themselves and they can put their own rebuttal. So I definitely have had a few moments where my mom will look askance at something I've done and be like, I think that's an exaggeration. I think that you're a little off. But the real pride I feel is like when I can show her something and she's like, wow, that's like exactly how it happened. And somehow,
That's a win.
just from hearing, I know you use this a lot in your book too, that like mechanism of like transcribing a conversation you have on the phone into a whole scene.
Yeah.
I really relate to that because I do that all the time. Like you have to turn, especially like you said, with private parents who do not like their business aired, and never imagined that I would never do this with our stories. They're a little protective of it, but yeah, I definitely feel that sense of pride when they can look at it and they're like, oh, I see what you're doing, and I kind of like I approve. Like this is on the right track. But there are a couple instances where, especially my webcomic for Secret Black Woman, where it's like your perspective as a kid is so different from your parents' perspective. But it's created a lot of opportunity to have those conversations with them. And that's like, would have never happened without comics.
That's great. And so The Secret Black Woman was released as individual comics before it was put together.
Yeah, it was like some crummy Tumblr webcomic for a really long time. I hid it from people. I was just doing it for fun. And then I like, it's like, oh, I've been working on this for 6 months. Here's like 15 different comics all about you, by the way. You're welcome. But yeah, and then it turned into like more focused little stories. But definitely the family had a little side eye at first.
Well, when I first saw you at Mini Mice last August, and I saw the Secret Black Woman comic, I just like, I have to talk to this woman. And then when we spoke at a Comics and Color session, and I just found that there was so many parallels to us kind of like exploring our family history and our biracialness and what that means and where does that leave you. So I really appreciate you working on that story as well, right? Because I don't think there's not a lot of stories about biracial children or growing up biracial and what it entails and how it kind of puts you in this different category outside of everything. So I appreciate that. I'm just saying that in public.
Definitely
Like,
relate.
in front of all these people. I think it's great. So, who are, and I always love to ask this question to find out what brings people joy. Who influenced your storytelling? Who do you go back to when you're like, I don't know how I'm going to tell this story? Who do you go back to and look at and say, okay, they did it right. I can do this. And I want Tom start.
I don't know. That's kind of a tough question. I don't think any one person really pops to mind. Like when
It
I'm
doesn't have
stuck or
exactly
something.
that, but who
But if there's
do you influence how you did your work?
if there's a type of person that I feel like I sometimes fall back on, it's comedians. Like comedians to me just wear their hearts on their sleeves most of the time, and they just tell the most brutal, crazy things. And you can tell they're getting some sort of therapy out of it as well. They're getting feedback from the audience. And I feel like that kind of bravery to do that kind of thing, I will sometimes look towards, and I'll listen to, some, horrible meaning great, but horribly brutal comedians and say, yeah, I want to feel that level of freedom and just that, ability to just kind of express myself. And then the more analytical side of me wants to see, and can I pull it off? Like, it's one thing for me to write down something that I think is, out there, but is it actually out there? And is somebody going to also understand where I'm coming from? I'm not looking to just shock people. I would rather have a discussion about things, but, I feel like that's definitely a part of my brain that I'll go to.
So
if that's a person.
Name me one comedian that does that. That does a
So,
good job of
even a guy like, who just passed away, Gilbert Gottfried, who's like, blah, blah, and he's like this loudmouth, crazy, like, just saying whatever he thinks type person. I don't love all his stuff, but it's that style that I like. Or like there was a guy named Greg Giraldo who was horrible and just did the worst roast and just did the most, vicious things. But it just was so pure and honest that to me it was, like you can't deny how pure that was. And I just kind of want to get to that place sometimes.
Yeah, there's something that I respect so much about artists who can like really bare themselves,
Yeah.
like all the embarrassing details. I strive for it, but I definitely am not there. How about you, Dave? Who's a good influence?
Well,
Do your thing.
I think like comics has like ever since American comics were created in the form that we know and love. They've always been influenced by like movies, and then early comics like vaudeville. Like not so much people being influenced by vaudeville today, but like definitely like I appreciate a good screenplay, like a well-written screenplay. And I was racking my brain right now trying to come up with something that stands out. But really well-written movie stands out to me, and I always make a note mentally about like how can I do that in comics, and then if I'm lucky enough to be able to remember that or that I wrote it down somewhere, then that's something to be able to refer to. As far as people working in comics, whenever I hit some sort of like narrative stumbling block, I always ask myself, what would Jaime Hernandez do? and I open up like Love and Rockets from really any point, and that's just there's some brilliant storytelling there, and he has such an economy of style, and that he's been able to do it for as long as he has with the same set of characters, and that they're aging along with him. It's just mind blowing to me. And so, yeah, Jaime is definitely somebody that I turn to pretty regularly. But I look to all comics. I'm fortunate that Hub Comics is down the street from me in Somerville, and that there's just really great comic shops in the area. Tony downstairs, Millionaire Picnic. I love Tony. And just going in and seeing what's new, and just being like wowed by people's different narrative techniques. I was really nerding out that Ben Passmore is here, and I'm psyched that I got a chance to meet him. And just being able to introduce forms of storytelling as a teacher, to students. I almost feel, and I told Ben this, that like I feel like my semester is divided by before I talk to my students about your black friend, and then after I talk to my students about your black friend. Like it's just, it's such a good comic. It really is. So yeah, those are my influences.
Awesome. Thank you. Ingrid.
I think I have movies on the brain, and I blame talk for making me think of Bruce Lee. So I have a joke answer to the identity-based comics, which is like, I don't know if anyone remembers Dragon, a Bruce Lee story.
Oh,
It's
yeah.
like I think I burned that out as a kid on VHS, just watching it over and over with my brothers. But I think about that, like the sort of like dramatized, glamorous version of your own life story, like told by people that are not you. And yeah, I think I even reference it in one of my comics too, because it was so like formative. Really random. And then I'd say for like the fiction stuff, the storytelling that I like is like, I think of Guillermo del Toro movies where the story is simple, straightforward. It's like a fairy tale, but it's chock full of references and nerdery and like subtle lore. It's just like more complex than it seems on the surface, and also like horror, which is what I gravitate to when I'm not writing about myself. But yeah.
Awesome. Well, very good. Well, we're almost out of time, but I wanted to just have everybody tell us what projects, just go through what projects you're working on currently.
Start. So yeah, again, I'm working on this middle school kind of age, Secret Asian Man. So I guess Secret Asian Kid or something, something like that.
Working title.
Which is I literally have a sketchbook downstairs. I think I'm on a page 117. It's probably going to be about like 150, 160 pages. It's all thumbnailed now, so like once we get a green light to go ahead with that, it's going to be a ton of work to finish that thing.
Did you say 160 pages?
Something like that, yeah. It's going to be 7th and 8th grade, basically, with a summer camp in the middle. And so yeah, I mean that's kind of it, and tons of research, like you were saying with historical. Like once you look into things like, there was a night when my dad told a story about the firebombing in Tokyo, which I had no idea, and just came out of the blue. And so, obviously I didn't remember every word that he said, but I wanted to get dates and things like that correct. I knew how old he was, where it was, and then the rest of the research I had to do. What did those bombs look like? What did the planes look like? What did the buildings look like? And so I'm doing all this side research for that, looking at also New York City in the 80s. So like that's a lot of the reference stuff. What kind of graffiti was there? What did the subways look like? What did the bikes look like? What video games were out at the arcade? All these things that just kind of have been fun to research. So that's what I'm in the middle of now. So hopefully by summer, we'll have, kind of an end in sight, things get a little more formalized, and then that should hopefully be out maybe next year at some point.
Nice.
So I'll
So
see.
next year's
Congratulations.
Comics and Color Festival.
Exactly.
Sweet.
That's the deadline.
Locked in. And how about you, Dave? What are you working on now?
I have a few book pitches out to a few people, so hopefully I hear something good back on those.
I know you can't give any details.
Yeah. One thing that I am doing that I can talk about is I created this 16-page comic a few years back called Hacienda, about this haunted hacienda that it's working on. There's like two different stories going on. This ghost hunter show is at this place, and then the story of what actually happened 100 years previous is also being told. And so anyway, I'm redoing that to republish that and put that together with more stories as a book.
Is it going to be like a horror-based book, or is that?
It's more like science fiction, kind of speculative fiction type deal. Yeah, that's exciting. And then the other pitches are YA pitches because that's where all the money is now.
Right?
YA is white hot.
I don't know why I didn't picture myself. And what about you, Ingrid?
Right now, I'm like I mentioned, released that new comic called "Girls Steal Your Beauty." It's that pregnancy horror series of fiction stories. And then what I'm working on, mostly just my kickflip.
Yeah, how's that going?
Anything
Nice.
cooking
Good
right
ollie?
now. It's a little tough. Yeah, I got the ollie down. My skate crew in the back. But yeah, and so all that's for sale downstairs. Yeah.
Nice. Okay, so last question. Just give us how people can find you. I know all these people are going to want to buy all of your work immediately. So where can they find your work?
Quickest way, talk Toyoshima under Instagram. That's it. That's where you're going to find most of the stuff. I'm on Facebook too, but Instagram is the way to go.
Nobody uses Facebook.
Exactly.
How about you, Dev?
Quickest way is downstairs across from Ben Passmore's table.
Nice.
I like that answer.
I'll be
Besides today. Where can
Besides
people find
today.
your work?
DaveOrtegaDraws.com.
It's here every day.
Yeah, I'm here every day.
The Dave Ortega Draws.
And Instagram, Dave Ortega Draws.
Excellent. Easy to remember.
And I'm on Patreon too, apparently. So
Yes.
Dave Ortega, Patreon.
There you go.
2 supporters.
Nice.
And you can find me on Instagram. Ingrid V. Pierre is my handle, and then my website, if you want to buy my comics online or get them digitally, is verona-creative.com.
Yes. And all of them have comics downstairs. You can purchase right after this. Mm-hmm. So I want to thank everybody for coming out. I want to thank my amazing panelists. This was a great conversation. I'm really glad that we were able to do this today. And I just wanted to let everyone know, me personally, I've been working with Company One on a play called Black Superhero Magic Mama, which is premiering today at the Copley branch of the library, and it's going to be going for the month. It's free, pay what you can. And tomorrow I'm doing a talkback. I did character design and comics and animation that they're projecting on screen during the play. So it's tomorrow I'm doing a talkback at the 2 p.m. performance. So if you're around, come check that out. Like I said, it's free and at the Copley Library. And yeah, and that's it. So thank you all so much. This was amazing.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. And enjoy the rest of the festival.
Wow. Pretty slick.
Yeah, that was fun. That was fun.